The minute of the Cabinet Defence Committee meeting held on the 17th of March, 1953, runs to 4 pages in the National Archives at Kew under file CAB 131/13. Item 4 on the agenda concerned what the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir John Slessor, described in carefully neutral language as special photographic reconnaissance over denied territory. Winston Churchill, returned to Downing Street some 16 months earlier, listened to the proposal with the particular attentiveness he reserved for matters involving the Americans. The request had originated not in London, but in Washington, where General Hoyt Vandenberg of the United States Air Force had pressed his British counterparts repeatedly through the winter of 1952. The Americans wanted the Soviet missile development site at Kapustin Yar photographed. Their own RB-45 Tornadoes lacked the ceiling. The English Electric Canberra, by contrast, could reach 48,000 feet on a good day with light fuel. And its Avon engines gave it a margin of perhaps 4,000 feet over anything the Soviet Air Defense Forces could send aloft. Slessor presented the technical case in 3 paragraphs. Churchill is recorded as asking only one question, according to the Secretary's longhand note: whether the aircraft, if lost, could be plausibly disowned. Slessor replied that the camera fit was American, the navigation aids partly American, and the crew would be flying without identifying markings beyond standard RAF roundels. Churchill grunted his assent. The operation received the cover designation Robot Nanny, a name selected with the studied banality typical of Air Ministry's security branch. Authority was delegated to Air Marshal Sir George Mills, then Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Bomber Command at High Wycombe. Mills selected Number 5-40 Squadron, based at RAF Wyton in Huntingdonshire, as the operating unit. The squadron commander, Wing Commander Freddie Ball, was briefed personally at the Air Ministry on the 3rd of April. The briefing took place not in the main building on King Charles Street, but in a side room at a Dastral House on Theobald's Road, where the security register did not record visitor names. 3 Canberra Mark Twos were modified at Marham over the following 10 weeks. The work was conducted in a hangar designated as undergoing routine engine refit, with the actual fitters drawn from a pool cleared by the Director of Special Projects. The American cameras, F-49 variants with 36-inch focal length lenses, arrived by United States Air Force Globemaster at RAF Mildenhall on the 11th of May and were transferred under armed escort the same evening. Each camera weighed a fraction over 200 pounds, and the installation required removal of part of the bomb bay structure and the fitting of optical quality glass panels in the lower fuselage. The crews were selected from existing 540 Squadron strength. Flight Lieutenant Robert Anstey, the navigator who would later attempt the August sortie, had flown Mosquito photographic reconnaissance in the closing weeks of the war, and had 3 years on Canberras before being approached. The pilots were drawn from the same small pool. None signed the Official Secrets Act afresh, this being assumed already in force, but each was required to attend a personal interview with the Vice Chief of the Air Staff. The recorded purpose of these interviews, in the Air Ministry diary, was simply establishment matters. The men were told that if they were shot down over Soviet territory, His Majesty's government would publicly deny any knowledge of their flight. The Canberra B Mark II was, by the summer of 1953, already the standard light bomber of Bomber Command, with deliveries having commenced to Number 101 Squadron at Binbrook some 2.5 years earlier. The aircraft selected for Robot Nanny, however, were not standard. They had been stripped of bombing equipment, fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks in the rear bomb bay, and given a polished natural metal finish in place of the usual medium sea grey upper surfaces. The polishing was not cosmetic. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, then chief test pilot at English Electric, had established during high-altitude trials at Wyton that surface friction at extreme altitude could cost an aircraft as much as 800 feet of ceiling. The fitters at Marham burnished the airframes with jeweler's rouge over a period of 3 days. The cockpit itself remained cramped and, by modern standards, primitive. The pilot sat under a fighter-style canopy on the port side of a stepped fuselage. The navigator sat behind him in a windowless compartment lit only by instrument bulbs and a single overhead lamp. For the photographic sorties, a third crewman, the camera operator, occupied a jump seat aft of the navigator with access to a small optical sight and the camera control panel. At 48,000 feet, the cabin pressurization maintained an equivalent altitude of around 25,000 feet, which is to say that the men breathed through oxygen masks at all times and suffered the standard symptoms of mild hypoxia despite the regulators. The Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 101 engines produced 6,500 pounds of static thrust each at sea level. At 48,000 feet, that figure fell to perhaps 800 pounds, which was barely sufficient to maintain straight and level flight. Any maneuver, any deviation from the most economical cruise setting risked what test pilots called the coffin corner, the narrow band between stall speed and critical Mach number, which at extreme altitude could be as little as 20 knots wide. The aircraft would buffet, the controls would stiffen, and recovery, if recovery were possible, required an immediate descent of several thousand feet. The American F-49 cameras represented a different problem altogether. Each carried a magazine of 250 exposures on 9-inch film, and the shutter mechanism, designed for stable platforms, was sensitive to vibration. The installation at Marham included rubber isolation mounts of a type developed at the United States Air Force's Wright-Patterson Laboratory, but the engineers at 540 Squadron found that even at altitude, the resonance from the Avons could blur exposures taken at the longest focal length. Anstey, the navigator, recorded in his post-flight notes that the third of 3 planned passes was generally the most usable, the aircraft having settled into its high-altitude cruise by then. Navigation to the target presented the greatest single difficulty. The Canberra standard equipment included GH, useful only over Western Europe, and a sextant of the type fitted to Lancaster bombers a decade earlier. For Kapustin Yar, neither was sufficient. The crews were therefore required to navigate by dead reckoning corrected against radio bearings from neutral broadcasting stations, principally the long-wave transmitters at Ankara and Tehran. A single 1-degree error over the 800-mile run from the Iranian frontier translated into roughly 14 miles of displacement at the target, which would put the cameras over empty steppe rather than over the missile complex. Anstey spent the better part of 2 months on simulator runs at Bassingbourn before the operational sortie was attempted. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, the Vojska Protivovozdushnoi Obrony, or PVO Strany, maintained a chain of early warning radar stations along their southern frontier from the Caucasus to the Caspian. By August of 1953, the principal sets in operation were the P3, known to Western intelligence as Dumbo, and the newer P8, designated Knife Rest by the Joint Anglo-American Technical Intelligence Staff at RAF Medmenham. The P3 operated at frequencies between 72 and 80 MHz, with a peak power of around 120 kilowatts, and could detect a Canberra-sized target at heights up to 60,000 feet, at ranges out to 240 kilometers in clear conditions. The P-8, only recently fielded, offered slightly better high-altitude performance but suffered from severe ground clutter problems in the rolling terrain west of Stalingrad. The Robot Nanny sortie launched from RAF Wyton in the small hours of the 28th of August, 1953. The aircraft, captained by Flight Lieutenant John Crampton with Anstey navigating, staged through Giebelstadt in the American zone of occupied Germany and thence through Habania in Iraq, refueling at each stop with the assistance of cleared American ground crews. The actual penetration began at 0400 hours Greenwich Mean Time, the Canberra crossing the Iranian-Soviet frontier at 48,000 feet, some 70 nautical miles west of the Caspian shore. The first PVO log entry survives in fragmentary form in the archives of the Russian Defense Ministry at Podolsk, declassified piecemeal between 1996 and 2004. The duty officer at the Voronezh Sector Control, a Major Antonov, recorded an unidentified contact at 0417 hours Moscow time, bearing 260 degrees, range 320 kilometers, altitude estimated above 15,000 meters. The estimate was conservative. The actual altitude was closer to 14,600 meters, but the Soviet height-finding equipment of the period struggled above 13,000. Antonov classified the contact initially as a possible weather balloon, the standard fallback designation for high-altitude returns that defied immediate identification. A second log entry, timed at 0423 hours, upgraded the assessment. The contact was now showing a steady ground track at high speed, perhaps 800 kilometers per hour, on a heading consistent with deliberate penetration toward the Volga. Antonov telephoned the regional command at Stalingrad and requested fighter readiness. The duty controller at Stalingrad, a lieutenant colonel whose name is given only as Kovalenko in the surviving documents, ordered 2 MiG-15s at Lipetsk to cockpit alert and a further pair at Engels to 15-minute readiness. The MiG-15, in its current production variant, had a service ceiling of 15,500 meters, which was to say that the Canberra was already operating above the practical interception altitude of any aircraft in the regional inventory. The PVO log records something else of interest. At 0431 hours, a separate entry from a P-8 set located near Saratov reported the same contact and added a note. Track behavior consistent with reconnaissance. Request guidance from Moscow District. The reference to Moscow was a procedural one. Major operational decisions concerning unidentified high-altitude penetrations had, since the Yak-25 interceptor program had been authorized the previous autumn, been routed through the central command of PVO Strany at Moscow rather than handled at regional level. The duty staff in Moscow, however, were occupied with a separate alert concerning a Turkish Air Force exercise near Kars, and the request from Saratov sat unanswered for 14 minutes. The Kapustin Yar test range lay some 100 kilometers east of Stalingrad, on the left bank of the Volga, in country that the Soviet topographical surveys described as semi-arid steppe. The site had been established in May of 1946 on the personal authority of Stalin, following the recovery of German V-2 components from the Mittelwerk and the deportation of the relevant Peenemünde technical staff to the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1953, Kapustin Yar housed the principal launch facilities for the R-5 missile, a development of the V-2 with extended range, and preliminary test stands for what would become the R-7 intercontinental rocket. The R-5 had first flown successfully on the 15th of March that year. Its existence was known to British intelligence in outline only, through fragmentary signals intelligence and the debriefing of a returned German engineer named Helmut Gruttrup at Friedland Transit Camp in November 1952. Crampton brought the Canberra over the target at 447 hours Moscow time, by then some 30 minutes inside Soviet airspace. The cameras began running at a point approximately 22 kilometers southwest of the main launch complex, on a track that would carry the aircraft directly over the principal R5 pad and the associated propellant storage facilities. The F-49 cameras were configured for vertical and oblique coverage, the vertical magazine running at 2-second intervals and the oblique pair at 3-second intervals. At the aircraft's ground speed of approximately 760 kilometers per hour, this gave overlapping coverage of a strip some 40 kilometers wide. The photographs, when developed at Brampton 3 weeks later, would show a great deal that was new to Western intelligence. The R5 launch pad, a concrete apron measuring approximately 90 meters by 60, was clearly visible with its associated flame trench and umbilical tower. A second pad, then under construction some 3 kilometers to the northeast, was identified later as the test stand for the AA-7. The propellant storage area, comprising 6 cylindrical tanks of an estimated capacity of 200 cubic meters each, lay to the southwest behind a low earth berm. A railway spur of standard Soviet 5-foot gauge ran from the main Astrakhan-Saratov line directly into the complex, terminating at a covered loading platform that the interpreters would later identify as the missile assembly building. What the cameras did not capture, because no R5 was on the pad that morning, was the missile itself. The British and American intelligence staffs would not obtain a clear photograph of an R5 for a further 2 years, when a defector's testimony was supplemented by a separate American overflight in 1956. What Crampton's sortie did establish, with photographic certainty, was the scale and the operational character of the site. Until that morning, Kapustin Yar had existed in Western analysis as a series of inferences. After it, the Joint Intelligence Committee in London possessed 372 photographic exposures from which the development trajectory of the Soviet missile program could be measured. The aircraft completed its run over the complex in approximately 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Crampton then turned southeast, increased to maximum continuous power, and began the return leg toward the Iranian frontier. The cameras were stopped, the magazines wound off, and the lower fuselage hatches resealed. Anstey gave Crampton a fresh course of 165 degrees true, intended to clear the airspace by the most direct route consistent with the fuel state. The Canberra had perhaps 430 miles to run before reaching neutral airspace, with a fuel reserve, after the photographic run, of approximately 1 hour and 12 minutes. The fighter regiment at Lipetsk, the 179th Guards Interceptor Aviation Regiment, had been on cockpit alert since 425 hours Moscow time. 2 MiG-15 bis aircraft sat at the runway threshold with engines running. Their pilots, Captain Mikhailov and Senior Lieutenant Sokolov, breathing oxygen from ground supply. The order to scramble came at 449 hours, 2 minutes after Crampton had completed his photographic run over Kapustin Yar. The delay was not the fault of the regiment. The PVO command had taken a further 15 minutes to confirm the threat assessment, and the order to engage had passed through 3 command levels before it reached Lipetsk operations. The MiG-15 BIAS represented, in the summer of 1953, the most numerous interceptor in Soviet service. Powered by a Klimov V-K1 turbojet of approximately 26 kilonewtons thrust, it could reach 15,500 meters in approximately 7 minutes from brakes off, given an optimal climb profile. Mikhailov and Sokolov, climbing on a vector of 270 degrees toward the retreating Canberra, achieved 14,000 meters in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. By that point, the target was already 80 kilometers south of them and continuing to draw away at a closing rate that, given their respective speeds, would have required approximately 4 minutes of pursuit to bring within gun range. The MiG-15 carried two 23mm Nudelman Suronov cannon and a single 37mm Nudelman, with effective ranges of approximately 800 meters against a maneuvering target. Sokolov's debrief, recorded the same day at Lipetsk and surviving in the Podolsk archive under Fond 35, Opus 234, contains the operational detail that mattered most. He could see the Canberra. At 14,200 meters, with the morning sun behind him, he had a clear visual contact on a polished metal aircraft above and ahead at an estimated altitude of 15,000 meters or higher. He could not close. The MiG-15 at that altitude was operating at the limit of its envelope, with control surfaces approaching the buffet boundary and engine performance falling away with each 100 meters of climb. He attempted a zoom climb, trading airspeed for altitude in the manner taught at the Stalin Air Academy, and reached perhaps 15,400 meters before the aircraft refused to climb further. The Canberra was, by his estimate, some 2,000 meters above him. The fuel state crisis began at approximately 0503 hours. The MiG-15, BIS, carried internal fuel of 1,412 litres, sufficient for approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes at economical cruise, but considerably less at full military power. Both pilots had been at maximum continuous since scramble. Mikhailov reported 800 litres remaining at the point of his maximum altitude. Standard PVO procedure required a fuel reserve of 300 litres for return to base and approach, which left him with 500 litres of usable fuel for combat. He held the pursuit for a further 4 minutes before turning back toward Lipetsk. Sokolov followed 30 seconds later. Both aircraft landed with under 200 litres remaining, well below the regulatory minimum. A second pair from Engels, scrambled at 0458 hours, never made visual contact at all. The Canberra was by then approaching the lower Volga and continuing south at a ground speed which, the Engels controllers calculated retrospectively, had reached approximately 790 kilometers per hour, with the assistance of a tail component of the upper level wind. The interception was, in the cold language of the post-incident report, not technically achievable with available equipment. The Canberra crossed the Iranian frontier at 0541 hours Moscow time, descending through 40,000 feet on a course for Tabriz. Crampton landed at Habania some 2 hours and 20 minutes later with approximately 140 gallons of fuel remaining. Perhaps 15 minutes of flight at economical cruise. The aircraft was inspected, the camera magazines removed and placed in sealed metal containers, and the crew driven directly to the British Embassy compound at Baghdad. The magazines themselves travelled by Royal Air Force Hastings to Cairo, and thence to Lynham, arriving in Wiltshire on the 30th of August. From Lynham, they went by dispatch rider to the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre at Brampton, near Huntingdon, on the same evening. The diplomatic dimension is the more curious part of the story. The Soviet government, which by any standard had every right to lodge a formal protest at a clear violation of its airspace, said nothing. No note was delivered to Sir Alvery Gascoigne, the British ambassador in Moscow, in the days or weeks following the overflight. No protest reached the Foreign Office through the Soviet embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens. The silence was, to the Foreign Office Northern Department, both unexpected and informative. The permanent Undersecretary, Sir William Strang, raised the matter at his weekly meeting with the Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service on the 8th of September, and recorded in his minute that the Soviet failure to protest must be taken as an admission that their air defense arrangements are not what they would wish them to be. The internal Soviet documentation tells a different story, accessible only after the partial declassifications of the late 1990s. A memorandum dated the 2nd of September 1953, addressed to the Council of Ministers and signed by Marshal Konstantin Vershinin, then Commander-in-Chief of the PVO, ran to 7 pages. It described the penetration in factual terms, named the failures of detection, identification, and interception in sequence, and proposed a program of measures. These included the accelerated deployment of the Yak-25 interceptor, the development of a high-altitude variant of the MiG-17, and most consequentially, the prioritization of the V-75 surface-to-air missile system, which would enter service 2 years later as the SA-2 guideline. The memorandum reached Lavrenti Beria's deputy at the Ministry of Internal Affairs on the same day it was sent to the Council. Beria himself had been arrested some 10 weeks earlier, on the 26th of June, and was awaiting the show trial that would conclude with his execution in December. The succession struggle that followed his fall meant that the Vershinin Memorandum was discussed in conditions of considerable institutional uncertainty. Georgy Malenkov, then chairman of the Council of Ministers, took the view that any public protest against the British overflight would draw international attention to a Soviet defensive failure at precisely the moment when the leadership transition required an appearance of stability. Nikita Khrushchev, then First Secretary of the Central Committee, but not yet the dominant figure he would become, supported this judgment. The decision not to protest was therefore made on the 7th of September at a meeting of the Council of Ministers Presidium. The minute, declassified in 2001 and held at the Russian State Archive of Contemporary History under Fond 3, Opus 10, Item 284, runs to a single sentence on the matter. The British provocation of the 28th of August will be answered by improvements in our air defence rather than by diplomatic protest. The decision was, in retrospect, the more damaging response. A formal protest would have produced a brief diplomatic crisis. The silence produced the SA-2. The Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre occupied a series of low brick buildings at RAF Brampton, near Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire, that had been requisitioned for photographic interpretation work in 1941 and never returned to civilian use. By 1953, the establishment housed approximately 340 staff, of whom perhaps 90 were trained photographic interpreters of officer rank. The senior interpreter on the Soviet target desk was squadron leader Douglas Kendall, a veteran of the Medmenham operation against the V weapon sites at Peenemünde a decade earlier. Kendall had been recalled from the reserve in 1951 and held the substantive rank of squadron leader with the local acting rank of wing commander. The 3 magazines from the Robot Nanny sortie arrived at Brampton in the early hours of the 31st of August. They were processed in a darkroom designated only by the number 7, which was reserved for material classified top secret code word. The processing chemistry, supplied by Kodak through the Air Ministry's photographic stores, required water at a precisely controlled temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, and the developing tanks held a single magazine at a time. The work proceeded through the day and into the evening of the 1st of September, with prints made at 1:1 scale on 9 by 9 inch paper. The total yield was 372 usable exposures, of which 241 covered the Kapustin Yar complex itself. Interpretation began on the 2nd of September. Kendall worked with a team of 4 interpreters. Flight Lieutenant Constance Babington Smith, who had identified the V1 ramps at Peenemünde in 1943. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Stone, an expert on Soviet rail infrastructure. Squadron Leader Patrick Stradling, who covered Soviet armored forces. And Flight Officer Margaret Hennessy, whose specialization was construction patterns at industrial sites. The team worked from a series of stereoscopic viewers manufactured by Hilger and Watts of London, which permitted 3-dimensional examination of overlapping pairs of vertical photographs. The first day's work produced a preliminary report of 14 pages, transmitted by dispatch rider to the Air Ministry on the morning of the 3rd of September. The report identified the principal launch pad and provided dimensions accurate to within 2 meters. It identified the propellant storage area and estimated the total propellant capacity at approximately 1,200 cubic meters. It identified the rail spur and the assembly building, and it noted the presence of what Babington Smith described as blast deflection works of substantial concrete construction around the launch pad itself. The presence of a second, larger pad under construction to the northeast was noted, but not at this stage interpreted. The fuller analysis took some 11 weeks. The final JARIC report, designated JARIC-SR-5-3-14, ran to 96 pages with 148 annotated photographs. It was issued in November and circulated on a strict need-to-know basis to the Joint Intelligence Committee, the Air Ministry, the Admiralty, the War Office, the Foreign Office Russia Desk, and through agreed channels to the United States Air Force at the Pentagon, and to the Central Intelligence Agency at its temporary quarters in the E Street complex in Washington. The report's principal conclusion, set out in paragraph 3 of the executive summary, was that the Soviet Union possessed at Kapustin Yar an operational test infrastructure capable of supporting medium-range ballistic missile development at a tempo previously unsuspected. The conclusion was supported by photographic evidence that the Joint Intelligence Committee, in its covering minute, described as of a quality and completeness not previously attained. The doctrinal consequences of Robot Nanny worked themselves out on both sides over the 14 months that followed. Within Bomber Command, the operation was initially classified a complete success and used as the principal evidence in support of further sorties. 2 more flights were attempted in the spring of 1954. The first on the 28th of April over the Ukrainian missile site at Pavlograd, and the second on the 10th of May over the Soviet naval facilities at Sevastopol. Both encountered substantially more aggressive Soviet responses than Crampton had faced. The Ukrainian sortie was tracked by improved P-20 radar from the moment of frontier crossing, and the crew, captained by squadron leader Harry Currell, reported visible exhaust trails from at least 4 MiG-17 aircraft attempting interception below them. The MiG-17 was the operational answer to the August 1953 failure. The aircraft had entered Soviet service late in 1952, but had not been deployed in numbers to PVO units until the spring of the following year. Its principal advantage over the MiG-15 was a service ceiling of 16,600 meters, achieved through a combination of swept wing refinement and the more powerful VK-1F engine. By the autumn of 1954, the regiments at Lipetsk, Engels, and Stalingrad had converted entirely to the type. A Canberra B Mark II operating at 48,000 feet, which is to say 14,600 meters, was no longer comfortably above the practical interception altitude of the defending fighters. The Air Ministry took notice. A meeting of the Air Council Standing Committee on Operational Requirements, held at Adastral House on the 17th of September 1954, considered a paper from the Director of Operational Requirements, which concluded that Canberra overflights of Soviet territory were now of marginal feasibility and substantial risk. The paper recommended that further sorties be suspended pending the introduction of an aircraft capable of operating above 55,000 feet. The recommendation was accepted. The Canberra program over Soviet airspace was wound up at the end of 1954, and the photographic reconnaissance burden passed by formal agreement reached at the Bermuda Conference of December 1953 to the United States Central Intelligence Agency and its emerging U-2 program. On the Soviet side, the Vashinin Memorandum's recommendations bore fruit at varying speeds. The Yak-25 reached operational service with PVO units in 1955, providing for the first time a high-altitude, all-weather interceptor capability. The MiG-19, which would offer a service ceiling of 17,500 meters, followed in 1955. The V-75 surface-to-air missile, the system that mattered most, completed development trials at Kapustin Yar itself in the autumn of 1956 and was deployed to operational regiments from the early months of 1957. It was a V-75 battery at Koselino near Sverdlovsk that brought down Francis Gary Powers's U-2 on the 1st of May 1960. The line from Crampton's August morning to Powers's May Day shoot-down runs through that one decision of the 7th of September 1953, taken by men who had not yet consolidated power and who chose institutional improvement over public protest. The British government, for its part, never publicly acknowledged the Robot Nanny operation during the lifetimes of the men who flew it. Crampton's role became known only through the partial declassification of Air Ministry papers in 1994, by which time he had retired to Suffolk and declined to be interviewed. Anstey outlived him by some years and gave a single recorded statement to the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive in 1999. The recording, catalogue number 20186, runs to 43 minutes and remains the principal first-hand account in the public domain.